So if you got one of those sets of irons that is just too heavy, maybe too stiff, maybe it's a bore through and you really don't know how to deal with it, but you want to go to graphite. Why do you want to go to graphite? Well, certain reasons, and we'll talk about that. So let's see what it's going to be like to take an iron shaft from steel to graphite. Welcome back to the McGolf Shop, and here we are year end. Very much a happy new year to everybody, and this is going to be probably the last video of the year, and why not on a club repair. Now, we're going to go from steel to graphite on some Callaway X20s. Callaway X20 was a game improvement club, certainly using Uniflex steel. And what they had was a very large cavity with some weight at the toe and the heel to give it kind of a balance, kind of an MOI feel is what that was for. They had a lot of offset on them, so it was not only a super game improver, but with those sole combination that it had, easy to get through the turf. It was a very big club, okay? And it used a Uniflex shaft. Now, Uniflex typically was like a mid-stiff shaft-ish kind of thing. It floated around from that, right? So right at the very bottom of the stiff to the very top of the regular, that's where I saw some of the ones that I've seen in the past. Now, originally it came with what you'll see here in this particular, that kind of a grip, right? It was a particular OEM style grip. It had the octagonal pattern, and it had a rib in it. You don't see that any day anymore. I mean, it had a for real rib so that you could set your hands to. Now, the other part about this is that it is a bore through, right? It is a bore through club. And that's what makes this thing kind of tricky. All right, so what we got to deal with here is, number one, we're going to pull them apart. And I've weighed the 5 and the 7 iron to kind of give us an idea of where we're at. And the results will be kind of surprising, okay? And then what we're going to do, I'm going to show you how to take these apart in 2 different fashions. I left the 5 and the 7 back because I wanted to see whether or not these things would work or not, and I think I can make it happen. Then we are going to show you how to install the graphite and what we're going to use in place of the OEM ferrule in order to make it a little bit more sturdy, and then we're going to see what happens in a parameter sort of way to putting graphite in there, okay? So let's go over that. Why do we want to do graphite, right? We're going to go from steel to graphite. Why do we want to do that? Well, in a lot of cases, we're doing that because we've lost distance or we want to hit the ball higher, the 2 biggest ones that I get the questions on. Others might be that it just fits better, all right? So graphite, why do we go to graphite? It's lighter. You get more swing speed, okay? Sometimes you get the bend profile that you want out of graphite, so they get you ball in the air. Now, when we talk about ball in the air, that can go a couple of different ways. It can go because of weight, right? Because the club was already too heavy and you're either breaking down on the back or you're releasing too early on the front in order to do this, where when you go to graphite, you whoop and you sit there and whoop and you get right down there at the bottom. That's always a possibility, right? Another one is that it's flexible enough. We can change the flex. In this particular instance, we are going to go to a lighter flex. We're also going to go to a lighter shaft, okay? We're going to a 65 gram, in this particular instance, we're going to go to a 60 gram shaft, okay? Now, that's going to be quite a bit lighter than the Uniflex in steel. 60 grams pretty light. So that's going to help us, be able to attack the ball. Now, what are we going to use in this graphite? Well, it's one of my favorites in Recoil, right? I've been a big Recoil fan for a while. Personally, I think they dropped off a little bit, and then with this new installation of the Recoil dart, I think they're a very good shaft again. What do we have? We have the UST Recoil ESX 460 in the F2. All right, the 460 in the F2 just turns out a 60 gram shaft. F2 is the senior flex, okay? So in this particular instance, we're leaving basically the bottom of the stiff and going to senior flex. So we're going to be able to get the ball in the air a little bit better, create a little bit more head speed so that it will travel a little further. And if you get a little bit of that snap, you might actually do a little bit of compressing so that you get the right kind of spin. So there's all kinds of things that can happen here. All right, so that's some of the reasons why we're doing it. We're leaving a what I would call an average steel shaft because it's in the OEM and it's a production model, and we're going to a very, very good aftermarket graphite. So let's go take some apart, and I'll show you two different ways that we can make that happen, and then what we're looking at when we go to put it back together. Here, as you can see, I've already got almost the entire set done except for this one and another one. This is the 7-iron. Now what we're seeing here is, of course, we have the bore through, which has a pin in the side of that, plus we have the OEM ferrule, which is basically an O-ring with a collar. Finding those are pretty tough, and when you're going to go to graphite, we're going to need something a little more substantial here, so that's where we're going to go with that. There's a lot more being grabbed here than would be in what you would call a standard hosel. So we're going to heat up, instead of just being right here where your hosel would be, is we're going to heat up into this area, then we're going to heat up into this area, heat up into this area, and this area, and then we're going to try and just spin it off. So let's see what happens here. Okay, we took a long time because there's just more surface area here. And then what we do just on typical steel shaft is we want to turn it. So I'm going to grab, there we go. You see how it's turning in there? And we just pull it out. And now we have a whole lot of stuff to go get out, and I'm going to do that with my drill brush. All right, so now the cool part about having a bore through is you don't have to ever worry about not getting everything out of the bottom because it's, well, it's right there. All right, so you should be able to see it. There we go. See that? And we see that this guy has got a shoulder in it. All right, let's do one more. All right, notice that the flame has got a tip on it, and that's the part we just want touching it because that's where it's at its hottest. In this particular instance, I have to remove this, and we're going to talk about that here in a moment. We just got to pull that out good enough. Now let's go to the other spot. Of course, now we have it in the shaft puller. Why would I be using a shaft puller? Well, let's just say that I couldn't apply as much heat as I wanted to on the prior one because there might be something in there I just don't want to melt. And voila, that one comes out. Now we got to clean this guy up. All right, if we see that, we get to see that there is a shoulder on that guy, and the bottom of that one's cleaned out. All right, so what we use is the butane torch because it's more localized application of heat. That's what it is. Now, we usually go about 60 seconds on it, but normally in 20-second intervals right at 3 sides. Well, because of the way that this is, I will go 30 seconds on the long sides because of the angle. So we are going to go up this way on both sides. Now, because it's all the way around, we have to go on the top and we have to go on the bottom of the head in order to get a good distribution of heat, which is typically going to be maybe a minute and a half, minute and 45 seconds, depending on how much you're working with, right? And then you can grab and twist. Why did I show you both? Well, if you had to use less heat, say that there was a very delicate badge on the back, or there was some sort of other paint that you didn't want to get, that you didn't want to deal with, or you just didn't feel like doing like that, and then you don't need to apply so much heat. You just put it in the shaft puller and good to go, right? And you can pull it out. Now, what the disadvantage to doing that is that the cleanout is a little bit more extensive. Not a ton, just more, because you've heated up that glue, that epoxy, and it wants to turn to a kind of an ashy form. And when you pull it out, it's really, really easy to clean out when it's a little warmer. Now, I don't mean bake it to 1,000,000 degrees, just a few more seconds. And the difference is, you know, instead of just wah, and you're done with it with a lot of heat, it's, you know, you're in there and you're working it around and you're inspecting it to make sure it's done. All right, so we got all that done. So let's get to some installing. Okay, so we've taken all the things apart, and now what we have to do is we have to put them back together. And this is where the tricky part comes in. Do I hear myself? I do. So what is tricky about this? There's a couple of things. Number one, we still want to do spinal line, which is getting it to, you know, bounce in the right spot. We want to do some frequency matching, and we also want it to match the bottom, right? So there's a lot that's going to be going on here. And again, we're going from what we'll call a standard weight shaft to a 60-gram shaft, and that's what we saw. So back into the build process, we weigh the shafts, weigh the heads, weigh the grips, just to make sure that we don't have anything out of spec. Shafts turned out pretty good. They're a gram either way. In fact, only 2 were light and only 1 was heavy. So they're pretty good setup for these guys. Now the heads were pretty good. The 5's just a tad heavy by a gram or 2. Nothing to get too excited about. And so it's a matter of putting these things together. All right, so I put one together just to see what would happen as far as flex goes. And I'm pretty happy with where it landed because of where this golfer wants to go with his irons. So that's what we're gonna base it off of that. So now let's go back to a couple of things and how we're putting it together and why I'm taking this path with you. If you see this, you see a lot of stripes in there, right? And you see this piece here, and there's a lot of cuts. Well, if you look, I don't know if you can see all that, but there's a lot of cuts down here. And the reason why that is that when it goes through here, right, when it goes through here, it gets narrow right about here, and it clamps down like this at this part. Now, you could say, Jim, well, can't you just sand it down? Well, from a iron perspective, no. There's just not enough meat at the bottom. That's the reason why they do that. Now, in graphite, there's a little bit more there. All right, there's a little bit more that you could probably pull that off. Would I? Honestly, no, I would not. So let's think of this in kind of a common sense term. You can either sand this thing off to where it's to almost a taper-like substance, all right? Because there's all the taper tips fit in there. No, they don't. All right, they're loose actually, but. So you can remove enough of this material so now those walls are thinner. That's a bit of a thing, right? So are you comfortable with that? Can be, can't be. But because keep in mind, this is a shorter hosel, right? You're only talking about this long. Yes, it goes back into here, but the attachment is right here for the entire shaft and then just half of the shaft right there. So what do? Well, because it's graphite, I'm not going to make, and I don't have as thin a blade, so it's kind of necessity is the mother of invention, is that my shaft cutter has a fine wheel. And what I'm going to do, instead of cutting 5 grooves that they had, 5 or 6 grooves, I'm only going to cut 4. So, you know, Jim, well, you just talked about taking off stuff and now you're cutting into the shaft. Correct. But what's happening here is it's going from this to that. It's creating a new shaft. Now we're going to put glue in between there. We're going to put a pin in there and hopefully solidify the bottom of this head. And that's what we're going to do. All right. So I knew what I need to do on the first one. So I'm going to take you through the next 2, which is going to be a 6 and a 7 iron. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to cut a little bit of this off. I'm going to do a little bit of sanding so I can put it on there, and we're going to kind of see what we can do as far as flex goes. So let's go do that. All right, so I'm putting it together. And here comes a pro tip. Pro tip. All right, so we've got these 4 slots in the end of the club. Placement of those slots to me is very important. All right, so if we have a head that sits in here like that, okay, sits in there like this, and this is the direction of the impact, that is where I do not want a slot. I want a piece of shaft sitting here. So I want my slots to look like this and look like that at basically, what, 30 to 40 degrees from that. So it's going to look like this, assuming this is where that impact is going to be. Something in that neighborhood, okay? Yes, we're going to squeeze them together, but I don't want the impact hitting right on the open because, you know, jarring could just set it loose. That's just me thinking, right? Could it? Probably not, but why give it a chance? So let's give it a, that's the reason why I was checking to make sure if I could move it a little bit in order to obtain the flow. So far in 3 clubs, it's been as prescribed. I didn't tip any for the 4, half for the 5, and an inch for the 6. So we're right on target with this one. Now the thing about recoils that I forgot was that the tip sizes on these guys are abnormally big. And it's because of the ion plating that's on them. They're not like, oh, we made them big on purpose. It's just that's the way the coating comes. So you're going to have to remove a little bit extra than maybe what you're used to if you're not used to working with these things. That's just something to consider, right? So I've got to build the rest. You don't need to see all that. And we'll come back when I'm ready to start gluing. Now that we've got all the shafts cut, they've been sliced into, they've been tipped, prepped, right? So there's a lot of rough, so all that epoxy has a place to hold on to. We frequency matched them and they turned out really good. And the idea was I got to flow them as well, and so we are all of them but one were logo up, and that one was off to the side. So I'm really kind of happy with this thing. It's turned out really good. Now, what are we going to do next? This is the gluing part of it. Now, there's a couple of things I'm going to tell you now, and then we're going to go do it. Number one is that you want this shaft to stick up just above the edge of the hosel. You don't want it looking down. Rookie mistake down below it. You want it above it because you're going to be removing it, and you want it to be nice and flat, and it has that professional appearance. Number two, you want to have plenty of glue that's going to allow you this. Now, I'm doing 9 clubs. Actually, maybe 10. I'm doing 9 or 10 clubs, and so I'm going to have to use like 2 piles of glue because this is an epoxy intensive setup, because I'm going to put glue between the slots, around the outside, around the inside of the hosel, inside of the shaft, so we can put a tip pin. A tip pin. Yeah, we're going to put a tip pin in it, and that's what makes that black stuff show up. Now, you know, in a steel shaft, it's a bigger hole. In a graphite shaft, smaller hole, so you need a different type tip pin. You guys know that going forward. Also, we're going to use a different ferrule, that 1/4 or that 1/8 inch ferrule, not very sturdy, not very happy, and basically they don't make them anymore. So we're going to go something a little more sturdy, which is a 1/4 inch. It's not going to look obtrusive, it's just going to look different, okay? So let's go to the bench and let's put together some clubs. All right, now you see us, we're all set up. I've got my ferrules, got my tip pins, got all the heads, everything's looking good. Now we just need to make some epoxy. One big squirt. I'm going to try another half of one. See how much I can get done. This is not a very fast cure. In fact, I don't want it to be in this particular instance. And let's get it mixed. All right, so we're putting this on here, and I'm putting a bunch of glue in so that it covers everything. We want to even be down in this area applying the glue. Just a little bit of it, so that when you put it in here, all the surfaces are touching. Now that we got that taken care of, we're going to put on our ferrule. Slide that guy down. There we go. Now we want to match up our flow line, so to speak. go. Now we're going to tap it. If we look, now we see how it's just above there, and that's what we're looking for. That way when we go to finish this off, it's going to look good and not silly. Okay, we get one of our tip pins. Lots of glue in the tip pin. Spread it around inside there. Get in there as good as we can. I'm not tapping, I'm not beating on it real hard, I'm just getting it in there so it'll stay. And then just like anything else, we wipe off all the glue. Okay, the 5. This time we'll do it a little bit, not necessarily in the same order, but close. This time we'll put the ferrule on. That way it doesn't have to squeegee out a whole bunch of the other stuff. Alright, so this time we're going to poke it down. Get it to where they're nice. Well, we don't need to align them just yet. Get our glue on here. Get some on the bottom end first. There we go. Now we have it there. And then we align everything. Make sure I'm above the bottom of the club. And wipe it off. Alright. This is a spot where you want to do a lot of work. So you don't have to do even more work later. We're all lined up, ready to go. Time for the tip pin. There we go. See, I got a bunch of glob on there. What that does is it helps get in between those slots that we made, and then we pump down on it. Okay. And then we get rid of the excess on that one. So that's how we get it together. That's how we get it to seat in there, and that's how we get to look good when we get ready to remove. Get ready to remove all of the excess that we're going to have right here. And now we're in line. So now I'm going to put all these together, and then we'll talk about finishing. All right, Happy New Year's to everybody. It is January 1. We started this the day before New Year's Eve, the 30th. And New Year's Eve was my anniversary, so happy anniversary to me. Thank you to Mrs. McGolf for sticking around for 38 years. So, hey, how about that? We had family over, and all work stops in the shop, which is not such a bad thing, okay? When you're doing when you're doing a bore through and you want to take off the back end, there's a real desire to want to whack it off really, really fast and get through it. And what that does, that builds up a lot of heat. And when you build up a lot of heat, you can weaken the epoxy and pull out plugs, loosen shafts, all kinds of things. So I really like to let these shafts cure in order for them to be able to take that kind of punishment. So waiting that day is actually not a bad thing, okay? So we've got them all taken care of. They're all dried up. Now what do? Well, what we need to do is we need to saw off the extra in that tip that I inserted, okay? If you saw it off, I use a back saw. Can you use something else? Yes, as long as you want to just saw off the very top of it. Now, why is that? Again, the same thing I was telling you about. You don't want to create a lot of heat so that pin will want to pull out when you're grinding on it, because everything's pulling away from you, right? You don't want to do that. All right, so once we get the tip off, now what we have is a choice of belts that we need. And what I use initially, because this is just a big removal of material, I tend to use sandpaper or a sanding belt on this one. And I don't try and take it all the way down to the metal, because I will scrape the metal in this case. Now, why is that? Well, in this particular instance, the iron is very, very hard with a very, very cool coating on it. And I have other belts that will do a better job than just scraping in there, which will cause me extra work. Okay, so I take it down to within a 1/16 of an inch. I try not to hit the thing. It's not the apocalypse if I do, because yes, I can remove it and shine it up. I just don't want to. All right, so once I get all those done, then I go over to what is a nylon belt. And this one's a blue nylon belt. So it is the second aggressive style of belt, right? and it will remove finish and it will remove stuff, but it also has a gentler satiny finish on the club, and it's not as brutal on these irons as, say, the sandpaper would be. So now we get into that and we take it off. So when I get those and they're all smoothed out, and it did a pretty good job. It smoothed them all right out, right on the flat that we had talked about where the hosel goes through and marries up. Now the risk on these is when you have these slots that the epoxy, you might not get, you have a bubble, right? Or a loose piece and there's nothing there and you have this open. And I had on 2 of them that happened, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Now what I do is I take that, and then what I do is it's called marrying the bottom of the club up. And what that means is instead of just right at the hosel area where I'm grinding, now I take it and I'll feather that all the way to the end on the bottom of the sole. The soles on these are fairly substantial, so they're meaning wide. So I'll run the blue belt or the iron right under the blue belt and feather, make it all look uniform, right? That's what we want. Now, we've got it all looking nice and uniform, then what? Well, if you want, and if you like that look, you can leave it like that. But they were shiny, and I haven't talked to the golfer on this one, so we're gonna make them shiny. So how do we do that? Well, on the wheel that's right next to my jet belt is a sisal wheel, and the sisal wheel is basically a really hard straw bound together into a wheel, and I'm using a black rouge. The black rouge is a high polish, and I lean into it pretty good, and I go up and I go 90 degrees to the way I went with the other belt to really get a good bite in the polish. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's what we do. And then what you want to do is, before you leave this, is that you want to polish it off or wipe it down just to make sure you don't have any surprise nuggets in there to make you go back, because rework sucks, okay? And we looked at it and we're pretty good. And from there, what we're doing is then we have to finish the ferrules, right? The ferrules are always the thing. We've done that. You've seen finishing ferrules on that before. And on this other one, I have the unstitched buffing wheel that I finish my ferrules with. I go to the bottom of the club one last time and give it a nice polish, okay? I give it this nice polish. So they look like they did when they showed up. That's the idea. They look like they did when they showed up. So now the next thing we have to do, and this part we need to talk about, I measured a 5 and I measured a 7. I went and found the specs, and they weren't like the specs. So we are going to make them like the specs. And I took those, I spec'd out or blueprinted 2 clubs, and now I'm going to finish these up. So hang tight with me for just a little bit longer, and we're going to tell you what the effects are from going from steel to graphite. All right, got them cut to length. We got them gripped on with some new Callaway 360 Tour Velvet grips, and we're starting to weigh them. Here's where we talked about the very beginning of it. Hopefully I said something good enough to keep you guys here this long. What was the difference? All right, so once we got them all cleaned up, we measured the heads. Out of all of them, the head that was the heaviest was the 5 iron. Imagine that. How about that for a pick? And the 7 was on track. So we got kind of a good comparison that we're going to do here, right? So the 5 iron was 37 3/4 inch long, where the 7 iron was 37 inches long. Now going back and look at the specs, the 5 iron is supposed to be 38. Now what happened? When you look at way OEMs put together clubs, now we're talking about X20, so this has been quite some time ago. They have this absolute fetish with swing weight. Got to be on those swing weight. Because why is that? Well, it's because their references are the tour players, and they have this hugely sensitive touch, this feel for swing weight, or the way that the club feels in their hands, which you could trick that up. And so they realize that this is important. The other part is it's one of the few measurable things that's the same across all companies. You put it in the same kind of measure, it's the same kind, right? So that's the reason. It would be my guess alone, that they made it a little bit shorter to compensate for the head weight in order to do this, because it's not like you can take any weight out unless they had a weighted badge in order to make that happen. All right, big long explanation on why it was shorter. Now they're all the same length as far as spec goes. So what happened? What happened now? Keep in mind, we took a Uniflex shaft, which is a standard weight about 125, with the regular OEM grip, and we're going to assume that it's the same weight as this 360 that I put in, and they both run right around 45 to 48 grams. I'd say that's pretty reasonable. Now we had to be 60 gram shafts versus 125s, right? So that's like 65 grams. Quick swing weighting is probably should be about 6 grams light, right? 6 grams light. It's not. All right, it's only a couple of grams light, or a couple of swing weight points light. Should have been like 6. So I'm looking at it should be in the D6, D7 range, easy, right? It's not. In fact, all of them are in the D0 to D1 range. Most are D0. I have 1 or 2 D1s. The rest are D0. So we only lost 2 swing weight points overall by doing this. How did that happen? The only thing I can think of is that the grips that we put on these are such a significantly different one that they're actually lighter than the ones that the Callaways put on, and that would mean that the shaft is actually lighter. That's the only thing I can come up with, because same head, same everything, right? There's no extra changes, no nothing. So it's got to be in the grip weight, right? Because I didn't grind anything, and that's where it is, because it is heavier than expected. I think it'll be a pleasant surprise. It'll still be lighter. Now, I'm harping on this swing weight. Is it a big deal? No, right? But the total weight for this gentleman, because we put F2s, they're now all equal in frequency because we did that earlier. Now, and they're lighter, right? This total weight, this gentleman is going to love this lighter weight, because that's what he was looking for. A little lighter weight, get a little more swing speed, pop the ball in the air. All those things are going to happen. What is that? I don't even know what that is. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my iPad's telling me it's New Year's Day. All right, so let's talk about this. So with the change from steel to graphite, what did we do? We lost a lot of total weight, and we lowered the flex. Now, that's not because of graphite, that's just because of the model that we built. Uniflex, we figured out, was beginning of the stiff range, somewhere up into the middle of the stiff range-ish, right? These guys are made to be more senior flex-ish, so that's going to happen. That's irrelevant of steel and graphite. Total weight's going to happen. The other bonus is it's going to be a tremendous shock absorber. So if you have any joint pain, arthritis, anything like that, this thing is going to mute a lot of the stinginess in the shot, and you're probably going to like it a lot better. The other part is that you actually have some, a little bit more choices in graphite, and that's just because of the way they're made. You can get heavier, lighter, flex in different patterns, all those different things. It's a little bit more flexible, we'll say, flexible in your choices, okay, and that's where you get from that. Outside of that, there you go. So if you got any questions, put them in the show notes. Again, we're going to have a live stream on Mondays at 5:30 p.m. Eastern, or 17:30. Join us. We can talk more about golf gear. Again, if you want, we're going to be, I think it's over this one. Nope, it's going to be over here. Over on this side, you're going to get a little circle badge right about here. It says, hey, this is McGolf. Subscribe if you would. And down here, you're going to get a big box that says, here's another video to watch. And if you would, take a look at that. It'll probably be something that you like. And as always, guys, let's see your scores go low.